Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How does the United Nations distribute information to the media, policymakers, and the general public? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on how he communicates with a wide range of people, not just in the United States, but around the world. My guest today is Mr. Stephane Dujarric, who is the spokesperson for the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. Stephane Dujarric worked almost 10 years as a correspondent for ABC News with postings in New York, London, and Paris news bureaus. Stephane Dujarric, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Great to be here, thank you.
I appreciate you being with me. Steph, you're the spokesperson. You are the one who are involved in, along with the Department of Public Information and several others, getting information out. What is your main conduit to help inform people about what is going on at the United Nations?
Well, my focus and my clients, in fact, are the journalists that are accredited and have their offices here at the UN or here full-time at the UN. We do a press briefing for them every day at 12 o'clock. And obviously throughout the day our offices and our doors are open to them to come follow up on questions, on specific projects they're working on. So my focus is really the press and the media. I have a lot of other colleagues who communicate on a wider scale, who focus on social media, on campaigns and outreach to universities, to young people, and to civil society.
And if our viewers would like, they can go to www.un.org and they can go to the spokesperson and then
you could just
right
Google UN spokesperson. You have all the information you need, and if you go to webtv.un.org, you can watch the noon briefing live every day, unless you have something better to watch, which some people do. Yeah.
Well, it's riveting, so there can't be anything better. Well, let's talk about Ban Ki-moon. He's outgoing Secretary General. He's the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations since the UN was formed in 1945. When he came in almost 10 years ago, he had 5 areas of emphasis, and let's just go through them briefly and just to get your comments on them. First was sustainable development, which encompasses climate change. Why was that so important for him?
Well, I think from the beginning, the Secretary General made climate change and the fight against climate change one of his priority areas. When he came in 2006, 2007, we were already well underway with the Millennium Development Goals. He really gave it a boost to ensure that we would try to meet as many of those goals as possible by 2015. And then he started working on the next generation of goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted unanimously in 2015. And I think he did it in a way which is sort of his signature move, which is to be as inclusive as possible and to ensure that not only member states, but civil society, business, all of us who are concerned in these issues are included in how we get to where we want to be.
And over the last 10 years, he has really been very actively involved, as you mentioned, in climate change. In fact, a lot of the observers who watch the UN say this whole climate change issue would not be as far advanced as it is today without Ban Ki-moon. Now, he didn't do it all by himself, but he was certainly a spark plug and pivotal in moving forward.
Indeed, I think he would never try to take the credit for all of it. But throughout his 10 years, he has knocked on every door, tugged at the sleeves of every world leader to ensure that this was an issue we all had a stake in. Even with, after what happened in Copenhagen, which we know was not the success and not the outcome we wanted, he didn't give up. And again, he turned back to the member states and he made sure that every member state came up with its own plan. And he did it methodically, he did it deliberately. He also made sure that there was always a door open to the business community. He took the time to talk to business communities, to insurance, to banks, investors, and also to civil society. And everyone understood. Everybody had a stake in the issue, and I think that's how we got to the agreement in Paris last December.
And we all have a stake in it. We live on this blue marble together. And we have to.
You know, here in New York, we're just, in fact, we're taping just a few a few yards away from the river, and rising water is something that concerns all of us.
Exactly, exactly. And New York City is spending millions of dollars a year on studies on how to keep the river from coming into the subway system. So you're absolutely right. Well, the second goal that he had, or item, was to prevent and mitigate conflict, which includes human rights abuses, as well as natural disasters. What is the status of that today?
Well, I think we unfortunately see the state of the world in a very honest way. We see continued fighting in Syria, in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, in a lot of places. But I think what the Secretary General has done is to ensure that human rights is at the center of everything we do through the Human Rights Upfront policy, which basically tells UN staff on the ground, development, humanitarian, political people, that human rights is the most important thing in terms of what we do. And they need to stand up and speak out whenever it comes to the defense of human rights.
Mm-hmm. Now, the third area is to build a safer, more secure world. What has been done in that particular area?
Well, I think, you know, when you take the whole package, sustainable development, human rights, that's what it's about. A safer world isn't just a world free from conflict. It's a world where every girl has an opportunity to go to school, where people have access to energy, where people have access to roads and to markets, where people's rights and dignity are respected. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals are the roadmap that we need for a better and safer world.
And of course, one of his, I think it was the fifth goal that he had, was to focus on women and girls and to make sure that there were more services available, they were incorporated as full members of society. Now, there's been the creation of UN Women and other activities. Have there been some other things that are underway to help women?
I think the Secretary General, first of all, has named more women to senior leadership positions than any other previous Secretary General, whether it's head of peacekeeping missions, whether it's force commanders in areas that were usually more the purview of men. I think there's been tremendous improvement in terms of the number of women in senior leadership positions at the organizations. He's also launched a number of outreach campaigns like He for She, which basically focuses on the responsibility of men when it comes to women's rights and the respect for women. And as you say, he oversaw the creation of this new entity focused on gender issue, which is UN Women.
And in a situation where there are countries that have had civil wars that perhaps been raging for years, decades perhaps, and they finally end, his last goal was to help countries in transition. Those societies are very fragile, they're very delicate, they have a great opportunity to fail more so than to succeed. What's being done in that area?
I think if you take a look at three countries, for example, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and now Cote d'Ivoire, all those three countries were countries where we are in a position of transitioning from peacekeeping to peace building. And that is done through sort of very sustained and careful transition, because once the UN goes in with a peacekeeping mission, we have to make sure, one of the lessons we've learned is that the drawdown needs to be very careful and needs to be slow so as not to destabilize the country both economically and also politically, because the last thing we want to do is withdraw too quickly to then have to come back 1, 2, 3, 4 years later if the country isn't stable enough, if the institutions aren't strong enough, and if the governance doesn't work well enough.
Now, you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 logical, practical, measurable goals that were adopted, I think, in September of 2015 by basically the 193 members of the UN General Assembly, and they're going to run over a 15-year period. What exactly do we hope will happen? What are a couple of these goals, and what will happen for this development agenda of 2030 over the next 15 years?
Well, what we have done...
What should happen?
Yeah, what should happen?
What should happen?
I think we have these 17 goals which cover just about every aspect of life, from human rights to health to education. And climate, of course. And I think the difference really between the SDGs and the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals is that Sustainable Development Goals are much broader, and they don't just focus on the developing world. I think every country in the world, even developed countries in the West, can always improve in terms of access to education, access to health care, gender issues. I know Finland, for instance, has taken a big internal national survey to see where they stack up on all 17 of these goals. So they're everyone's goals, and they're really the bottom line is to ensure that no one is left behind, that no one is left in poverty as the world moves on.
And these goals are very laudable. They're to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to empower women, to promote gender equity, to have decent employment, full employment, economic development, just on across the board. The UN member states are committed to that. How important is it to get other organizations, non-governmental organizations such as Rotary International, Lions International, Kiwanis, to buy church groups, religious groups?
We cannot do the work that we do, and we cannot fulfill the goals that we've set for ourselves without civil society, without business, and without civil society. I mean, to give you an example, you know, we have a tremendous partnership with Rotary International on the elimination of polio. I think civil society groups are critical because they are embedded in the smallest communities. I mean, there isn't a community in the world, I think, where you don't have some sort of a civil society organization, whether it's a, you know, one that's affiliated globally like the Lions or the Kiwanis, or to smaller local organizations. So they are there to really implement the goals with us, to help move them forward, and I'd say more importantly, to keep governments accountable, to keep governments honest, because we all know, whether it's government, whether it's institutions like the United Nations, we always need outside pressure to make sure we're on track and we're doing the work that we need to do.
And you mentioned Rotary, well, I mentioned all three of those groups, and they all three have a tremendous track record with the United Nations, Rotary in particular, with that phenomenal Polio Plus program that started in 1987 with the World Health Organization and the UN Children's Fund. It's just a remarkable program and just about that close to eliminating polio. Kiwanis International has had an iodine deficiency disorder program with the Kiwanis. The Lions have had programs, vision programs with WHO and UNICEF and different UN agencies. So there's a tremendous opportunity for groups to collaborate with the United Nations, and they're always stronger when you work together as opposed to working individually. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com and view some of our previous shows. Also, if you're involved in the media in any way, shape, or form, for example, if you're involved with PBS or Community Access Television, or perhaps with an educational institution that has an intra-campus television system, or you just have a website and you would like to share the programs, please go to the website and feel free to download them. They're provided free of charge at no cost as a public service to help people better understand international issues and how they impact people all around the world. Today we're looking at the United Nations and some of the programs and projects it has underway, and my guest is the spokesperson for the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Mr. Stephane Dujarric. Stephane, we were talking about sustainable development goals. We could spend another 15 minutes on that probably, but let's move on. We've got several items. Let's talk about peacekeeping. Peacekeeping was never mentioned in the charter that was adopted for the United Nations in 1945. In 1948, they had the first observer mission set up. Today, it is probably one of the most visible parts of the UN, along with the Security Council and the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF. What is the situation? You have 16 peacekeeping missions in some very dangerous areas of the world. How are they going? We'll talk about one or two of the problem areas as we go through this.
Well, as you say, peacekeeping is really one of the most visible activities that the United Nations does. We have more than 100,000 troops stationed all over the world, thousands and thousands of police officers. They provide a critical service and a critical function to countries in crisis. They often operate in very, very challenging circumstances like we see in South Sudan. And they go above and beyond the call on duty in the sense of talk about South Sudan, where the peacekeeping mission was there to set up right as the newest country in the world came to being. Within a year, it was spun out of control back into a civil war. The UN is now protecting more than 200,000 civilians in its camps, something that the mission was not designed to do. And the UN is there doing it on a rather meager budget. But it's challenging because, as you know, the UN has no standing army. So whenever a peacekeeping mission comes online, we have to go beg, borrow, and steal troops and equipment and police officers from around the world. And we're very thankful for those who give. But it's always a challenge to put these peacekeeping missions together.
And of course, as you mentioned, the UN has no standing army. You have to borrow the troops to work in these very dangerous areas. Now, so often you'll get troops, I'm sure this would be any case, of some who are very well trained, others who are not quite at that level. But at times you have troops that don't follow the military code of ethics. They violate laws. They do things reprehensible that you're not supposed to do. But what does the UN do on that? You have a zero tolerance policy?
Well, you know, the troops are given to us by member states. The Secretary General has no disciplinary authority over the troops. So if a soldier or a unit commits a crime or behaves badly or doesn't operate up to code, our only option from the Secretary General's standpoint is to repatriate them, to send them home. It is then the responsibility of each member state to ensure that if a crime was committed, we've had cases, horrendous cases of sexual abuse by very few peacekeepers who really tarnish the good work that the vast majority of them are doing. They go home and they need to be punished. And it's the challenge of the UN, because the UN writ large, the Secretary General, often gets blamed and is held responsible for things that are outside of his control, things over which he has no authority. But the Secretary General has been very clear. He's fired a head of mission. Just in fact this week, a force commander in South Sudan was found not to have performed up to expected leadership quality, and he was asked to go home.
And that is very understandable, and it's very commendable to do that. There's one situation that's arisen recently that creates a different challenge for the United Nations, and that's with the situation in Haiti, when some peacekeepers, I think Nepalese, went in 2010 after that horrific earthquake, went in with the best of intentions to help Haitian people to bring peace and stability to especially Port-au-Prince, but they started apparently a cholera epidemic. What can be done? I know the UN has tried to get money, and it has to go to donor countries. It can't raise taxes internationally, so it has to go asking for money. But should the UN not have diplomatic immunity? Does it have diplomatic immunity in a situation like that, where perhaps something negative happened because of UN people in country, but it was certainly an accident? It wasn't done intentionally, I'm assuming.
Right. I mean, you know, when you talk about Haiti, the UN does have immunity, and that immunity is very important for us to be able to operate around the world free of harassment. The immunity is not there to protect UN staff or diplomats from committing crimes. It's to protect us from harassment. I think on Haiti, our immunity has been reaffirmed, but that has not stopped the Secretary General from expressing his personal regret at the situation, expressing the UN's moral responsibility towards the people of Haiti. We've put together a program, a two-track program to fight cholera. One is to help Haiti, which has a very poor sanitation system, put in place a sanitation system that would help stop the spread of cholera, to kind of halt the spread of this disease. And the other is to bring support to communities that have been impacted by cholera, and we're trying to raise funds on that.
You mentioned two-track, and every time I hear that I think of reforms at the United Nations. Kofi Annan, I believe, was the one who started that two-track approach to bring reforms, internal and external reforms, to the United Nations. What has Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, not all of them, I'm sure he's implemented quite a few, but what are some of the reforms to make the UN a more efficient and a more effective organization?
Well, one is a reform on peacekeeping, how the peacekeeping works, the split between the field support department and the peacekeeping operation to ensure that everybody gets the support that they need. It has been about greater transparency in terms of ensuring that troop contributing countries, the Security Council, is kept well up to date as to what is going on in the field. And that there's been the implementation of a mobility policy to ensure that UN staff are able to rotate between the field and headquarters. And there's been a harmonization of the business application softwares. I mean, it's sort of very insider baseball, but for the first time, we now have a unified kind of back office, which allows managers to know exactly how much money they're spending, to know exactly what the staffing is, and allows senior manager to have a much better bird's eye view of how the UN operates in terms of budgets and human resources.
Now, you were a journalist for, well, with ABC News for 10 years. You looked at it from the outside to the inside, and now you're on the inside looking out. What are some of your perceptions as to how life was when you were back with ABC?
Well, when I was,
when
I was a journalist, I don't think I had a very high opinion of people who did jobs like the one I do now. I thought that some of them was
opinion has
flax.
changed.
Exactly, my opinion has changed 180 degrees, of course.
I can imagine.
But I think I'm very privileged because I think I have the best job in the building. It's an amazing job to be able to speak on behalf of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and to be able to speak on behalf of the organization. And in a sense, I still commit journalism, because in order for me and my staff to prepare for a daily briefing, we have to try to get answers out of this bureaucracy. So we spend our mornings really trying to squeeze information out of the rock sometimes that this bureaucracy is, to make sure that questions are answered. Most of the staff in the office are reformed journalists, so we know what the journalists are interested in. We really try to get that information to be able to answer your questions and your colleagues' questions every day at noon.
Now, obviously, it's a group effort, but the Secretary General is still sort of the CEO of the organization. He has the bully pulpit. You communicate with him on a daily basis, probably. What do you think would be one of the issues that he would be proudest of? Maybe not it's what he did himself personally, but what the institution did over the past 10 years.
I think to me it's easy. It would be the climate agreement. The fact that we reached after 10 years, after the failures in Copenhagen, in December of last year, we had a deal in Paris, and now it's coming into effect tomorrow on November 4th, which is something that we didn't even think would happen. We would just hope they would come into effect before he left office on December 31st. We're very pleasantly surprised that we have almost 96, 97 countries that have joined, and I think it's a tremendous success, and I think it's the thing he's most proud of.
Now, when Kofi Annan left 10 years ago as Secretary General, the 7th Secretary General, he was asked, he said, what was your perhaps biggest disappointment? And his biggest disappointment, as I recall, was he said he couldn't stop the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was really the match that set off the powder keg that has created a large number of the problems we have today in that area of the world. But what do you think the Secretary General would say as far as what he would have liked to have seen accomplished that perhaps wasn't accomplished? And not his fault.
I think obviously on Syria, on Yemen, on the conflicts we're still seeing, he would have liked to seen an end to those conflicts. I think what he's been disappointed in is in a number of places when he feels that leaders have not put the interest of their people in front of their own personal interests, and that a lot of the conflicts that we see, the civil conflicts, civil wars that we see, can be traced back to that, to issues of governance, to issues of leaders really placing their own personal interest above the interest of their people. And I think that's something that he has found greatly disappointing.
Now, your new Secretary General is coming in, Tonio Gutierrez, who headed up the UN High Commission for Refugees for several years, 10 years or something like that. He's coming into office. If you had a chance, I'm sure the Secretary General will talk to him at some point. Kimoon, he and Kimoon will chat. If you had a chance to sit down with the new incoming Secretary General, he asked you, Stephane, what are 2 or 3 suggestions you would give me, or ideas as to what I could do or should do, or maybe somebody to bring into the institution, or just something to help improve the UN's effectiveness? What would you suggest to him?
I would focus on transparency. I think this organization, like a lot of government or large institutions, can benefit from greater transparency. And I think our credibility is often tied, credibility in general is tied to transparency. And I think this organization can do a lot better in being transparent on how it does business, how the money is appropriated, and how decisions are taken. And I think that would enhance our credibility. And that's not just the Secretary General, but it's also the major organs, whether it's the Security Council and the General Assembly.
In our last 40 seconds, the hardest part, the hardest question perhaps is, it's often said that the really success or failure, so much of the UN operation depends upon the member states, especially the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Is there any way to bring the members closer together, or to have them working more in tandem? It depends from issue to issue.
It's the biggest challenge that we face. And I think over this past decade, especially the last 5, 6 years, we've seen a growing division between member states, especially on the Security Council. And I think that has really hampered our ability to move forward on a lot of issues relating to peace and security in this world.
And of course, the United Nations is not a perfect organization. When you bring 193 countries together, governments together, that's a recipe for perhaps some squabbling, for disagreement, and that type of thing. But the UN is still absolutely critical to do everything that we were talking about today, but also to help move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information around the world. You've got the International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring the Iranian nuclear deal. It just goes on across the board. There's not an issue that's not being dealt with in any state capital or any place in any country around the world that the United Nations is not dealing with it at an international level. And so, as Madeleine Albright said, the former Secretary of State and former ambassador here, said that the UN is absolutely indispensable. But Stephane Dujarric, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Always great to be on your show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.